Jonathan Pageau is about to go into kind of what a lot of people maybe consider the problem of pain. I find this fascinating, something that I've thought a lot about in my own life, in my own journey as a Christian, wondering why pain exists. Why does God allow pain? Or even wrestling with the idea of God being the cause of pain. It's hard to sort of wrestle with this philosophically because you almost sort of remove yourself emotionally from the question, and that's kind of a mistake in my opinion. I think you wrestle with it from where you are. I think that's the book of Job. I think Job teaches us that. And so Jonathan Pageau is gonna make the comment. They're talking about the birth story of Moses and how leading up to that, there's this edict that goes out to kill all the babies, and why would God allow something like that to happen? And Jonathan's point is that God is powerful enough to make good come out of evil. So let's get into it.
But God transforms evil into good all the time. That's what God does. He takes the evil. It's not that God wants evil, but that he is constantly covering it with his grace and his glory. And so it's like, this is the worst thing that could happen. It's like, kill all the children. And then all of a sudden God's like, no, there's one. We're going to replant the seed. And so you can't get rid of it. It's like its meaning will return. The law will return. The covenant will return. You can't get rid of it. Humans have no power to destroy creation.
In other words, death is not the end. God is in this. God has this habit of making life come out of death, ultimately pointing us to the death and resurrection of Jesus. But you catch on to that statement that Jonathan said: God is always in the business of making good out of evil, and then Denis Prager is going to challenge that.
Do you all agree with Jonathan's comment that God turns all evil into good? Is that a generally agreed to proposition at this table?
What a great question. I love that Denis is asking this question. I think ultimately I'm going to disagree with Denis. But I love that he's asking this question because it forces the people at the table to truly consider what they're claiming. Are we just sort of like Job's friends, showing up, and this guy is like suffering, and we're here to give our thoughts, or are we truly considering the implications of this idea that potentially God allows evil? Are we prepared to really grapple with that? So I really appreciate that Denis pushes on this point, because I think it opens up some really good conversation, not only on this table in this episode of the Exodus seminar, but for us today.
Comment that God turns all evil into good. Is that a generally agreed to proposition at this table?
That's certainly where the you might say the philosophically arrivable idea that God is omnipotent has to lead.
Yeah, so the philosophical, again, this is kind of like Job's friends, it's like the philosophically arrivable, idea. Yes, we can talk about it philosophically, but it is a philosophical question, but it's so much more. It's so much more than that when you're dealing with the pain that we all go through. Pain is universal in the human experience. We've all dealt with it. And certainly I think you do need to wrestle with it philosophically. We can't just check our brains out, and try to deal with it that way. But it needs to be a marriage, I think, between the philosophical and what would you call that? Emotional, psychological, but very much just like life, the real life implications of this question, and how each person has to wrestle with it in their own way, because not only is pain universal, it's also totally unique to your experience. And we might get to this because there's a profound idea at the cross that we could get to here?
I would say we're going to find out. I mean, that's partly what we do as we live.
For the
Okay, and so there's Jordan. Jordan gives the kind of, that's a better, maybe the better answer. Both are good answers, and I do hope that this podcast episode, this is an attempt. There's a lot of people at this table talking. I don't want to just create noise and frustration for people listening. So this is an attempt. Normally, I wouldn't try to interject some of my thoughts and thinking in and amongst a whole panel of people who are by far more wise than I am. But it's also an interesting experiment to see if, we're creating dialogue here. And so, like, what would you be saying if you were sitting at that table? You would have thoughts to share, and your thoughts are meaningful, regardless of, whether I'm as educated or whether we're as, well-versed or wise as everybody at the table. Everybody comes to this question with their own unique experience. So pain is universal, but it's also unique. And so we need an answer. We need an answer strong enough to, strong enough to meet that unique challenge of pain in this world.
Record, I've never understood that line, and I don't mean it at all disparagingly. My love for America's Christians is well known, and the calamity of the death of Christianity is, to me, the calamity of our time. I want to make that clear. But Christian callers began telling me that phrase. I'd never heard it in 15 years of yeshiva. And I'm troubled by it because if it's true, then A, why battle evil? Number two, doesn't it sort of trivialize?
Why not just leave it all up to God?
Well, yes, if he's going to turn it into good, I'm going to watch TV. I don't understand why that isn't the rational conclusion.
Well, you do see some of that. I do think you see that.
I just want to say one more thing. It reduces the evil that people have suffered, in my opinion. I can't tell a Jew who saw his children gassed, hey, listen, God's going to turn this into good.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe in the hereafter, that I do believe in very deeply, but you don't mean in the hereafter. You all meant in this world.
No.
Well, okay, so...
In the ultimate analysis.
In the ultimate... Okay. But, all right, so then I'll go back to number one. Why fight evil if he turns it into good anyway?
Yeah. Why fight evil if he turns it into good anyway? And can you just tell someone who's suffering through evil, hey, don't worry, it all works out for the good, Doesn't that make you feel so much better? So it trivializes, to Dennis's point, it trivializes the evil that someone is experiencing. If that person is going through that evil, experiencing that trauma, experiencing that pain, and someone comes up and just says, it's going to work out in the end. Just have faith. Wow. I almost want to say that that's a horrible response to a very real question, very real pain that people go through. Now, is it true? Yeah, okay, that's part of the answer, right? That's part of it, is that, yes, God ultimately is working all things for the good. We get it. Okay, check. Got it. You got me there. But that doesn't help. That doesn't help me. If I break my leg and someone says, don't worry, we can fix this, the pain of my broken leg doesn't go away with the knowledge that the leg might eventually be healed. That's true of physical pain. I think that's true of emotional pain as well. And so again, I just really appreciate that Dennis is pushing on this point to get us all to this place where we seriously consider the answer. Now, the other possibility that people come up with, and this is Job's friends, is you've done something wrong. You're suffering because there's something wrong with you, and that's the theme in Job. And maybe that's another podcast for another day. But ultimately, Job's friends don't come to Job with wisdom. They come to Job with false doctrine, which is that you have to suffer through, that your sin causes suffering. Now, sin is disobedience, rebellion to God, and it causes us to live in disharmony. So yes, sin ultimately does cause pain, but it's not us. It's not that God causes pain in our life for us to work out our sin. That penalty has been paid. Christ has paid that penalty for us. So there is no like karma. Here we're back to the the sort of like Eastern mysticism type of thing of like I want to say like retribution or something like that, where it's like you did something bad, so God is going to cause bad to you. That's not how it works either. Now there are consequences. I mean, I'm talking to my 6-year-old today, 7-year-old, 8-year-old. Gosh. I'm talking to my 8-year-old today about the consequences of his actions. So yes, there are consequences. If you commit sin in that way, like there's going to be consequences for it. But God's judgment is not to take the sin that you've committed and then cause pain in your life. So if you're suffering through pain, we have to remember that Jesus has paid the penalty for whatever sin, bad choices we've made. So the pain, in a sense, is not unrelated from sin, but is not directly related from sin. Maybe somebody can help us unpack this a little bit better. If you've got some comments to share, I'd love to hear that. So those are Dennis's points. Let's not trivialize the sin. If God just turns it to good, why fight evil? Don't we have a don't we have a moral imperative to fight against that evil? And then kind of what I'm lending to the conversation is the other thought that people just say, well, yeah, you made bad choices. Your sin has brought this upon you. It's like, whoa. That's Job's friends, and that's the reason I bring that point up is I think the book of Job has a lot of wisdom to teach us, and what it's directly pointing against is this idea that God caused this to happen in your life because you did that bad thing over there. And what ultimately it points us to is God's redeemer. There has to be another way.
I would say, I can't speak theologically. I would say the way I look at that is the same way, in some sense, that I interpreted the story of Moses, is that one of the manners in which God transforms evil into good is by calling on us to do so. And without our, I wouldn't say compliance.
But we don't transform bad into good either. We destroy bad, hopefully, but we don't transform it. The raped woman remains raped. Whether if we defeated the Nazis, but the Nazis caused, I don't know, tens of millions of people to die horribly.
But the question is not whether terrible things, in fact, utterly horrific things happen. It's whether there's any possibility of redemption of those very things.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And to what degree that's redeemable.
So, by the way, and I say this with love, and I mean it, I'm not being in any way patronizing. That's a Christian view of suffering. So I got to tell you this, forgive me.
What do you see as an alternative, Dennis?
So the question is not whether pain and trauma and evil do exist. The question is if there's any possibility of redemption. Dennis pushes back and says, you know what, that's a Christian view. Jordan then says, what other options do we have? Like, what other possible answers are there? Man, those are all really good questions. Like that exchange is really good. That was going to ring in my mind for a while. And my thought, of course, you've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you've got 8 people sitting around this table. You certainly don't need an extra one, so but if I was to jump in there, in that moment, I'd say, but what's the purpose of life? I mean, as horrible as rape, murder are, those are the 2 examples that he gave. As horrible as those are, why are they horrible? They're not horrible because the purpose of life is human happiness. They're horrible because the purpose of life is the worship of the Creator, to come into harmony with the Creator, to live in His world the way He made it. And those things are a rebellion of how God has made the world. And the consequence is pain and trauma. Okay, so if human happiness is not the purpose of life, but the knowledge and the worship of God is the purpose of life. And I know this is not easy to say, even as it's coming out of my mouth. I'm like, is it not possible that we could learn something about God through those experiences that would allow us to worship God more accurate to who he is, in a more powerful way, in a more potent way, truly knowing God post-trauma or having gone through trauma? There's a beautiful C.S. Lewis quote on this. He says that Christianity in the long run is a thing of unmistakable beauty or immense beauty, but it doesn't begin in beauty. It begins in dismay. But it's no use going on to that beauty without first going through that dismay. So the way to access the beauty and the joy and the worship, the glory, is not to go around pain, is not to avoid our pain, but is to go through that. No temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to man, but God is faithful to provide you a way out so that you will stand up under. The way out is to stand up under. Okay, so to go through the pain is the way to heal from the pain. Dan Allender has an amazing book called The Healing Path. And one of the main statements in that book is, don't waste your pain. If we encounter pain and trauma in our lives and we allow it to work its evil, then it gives birth to more pain and more trauma. If we're granted the ability to heal through that pain, which I think we are in a very powerful way, then that pain actually becomes one of the ingredients in our lives that allows us to return to God in worship in a more real way, that is genuine, that is potent and powerful in its transformative effect. And I think that having gone through that, most people would say, yeah, I'll take the pain. I mean, Paul says this, right? I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. That's a bold statement. If you think about what Paul went through in his life, I mean, shipwreck, like a guy was adrift at sea for a night and a day. Like, okay, like, yeah. Paul went through, I mean, I'll leave links to these Bible passages if you want to do some more study on this. But I think if you were to talk to Job, and I know this is hard, I know it. Like we're talking about people who have survived the Holocaust. We're talking about people who have survived something like the trauma of rape or losing a child. I mean, good grief, those are some of the worst examples of pain and suffering in this world. There are others, of course. I don't want to, bum us out too much as we're trying to sift through this. But if you just take Job, if you just ask Job, if you were to meet Job at the end of his story, having suffered through all that he suffered through, ask him, Job, was it worth it? He'd go, oh, yeah, like, whoa, like, no question. At the end of Job, he says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. He sees the God of the universe, infinite and perfectly holy. He comes into contact with the person of God. And would Job have traded all his suffering? Hell no. He would have been like, it's worth for these light and momentary afflictions are not worthy of being compared to the overwhelming weight of glory. Like that's the biblical perspective on pain. That it can be transformative, but not just transformative in the sense of, okay, you had an ouchie and now the ouchie is taken away. That kind of transformation. No, like transformation in the sense that a person who had only heard about God is now seeing his glory. That we who are far off have been brought near. Now that's through his pain and his suffering. So God uses the pain in our lives because human happiness is not the purpose of life. I think that's a huge clue. If we reorientate our expectation of life and say, well, the purpose of life is not my own comfort or happiness. The purpose of life is worship. And with that, I think comes knowledge, like true knowledge of God and the true worship of God, which is the response of God, which is the response to coming into contact with God. Then I can view my pain through a different lens. And doing that, I think, is one of the keys or clues to true healing from that pain. Because if I think that my comfort and my happiness are the purpose of life, that this is why God brought me into this world, then you get bitter and you go, well, God, why did you allow that? Why did you make this happen? Why, and you're stuck in that place. You're not in the place of like what Jesus, in the garden, freaking sweating drops of blood. He says, not my will, but yours be done. And one final point on that, and maybe we'll unpack this a little bit more, but have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus in his resurrected body, his transfigured body, the heavenly body that he's now, is seated at the right hand of God. Have you ever wondered about the fact that he kept his scars on that body? It's the transfiguration. It's transformed. It's made ready for heaven, And he brings his scars with him. He didn't have to do that. I mean, he could have made his heavenly body totally, without scars. But he chooses not to. I don't know if that helps. I realize that even that doesn't necessarily make it any easier. I wonder though my hope is that maybe it brings context and allows us to understand pain in a way that we haven't understood pain before. Do I dare continue?
How interested I am in this subject. So I have always asked the question why to any phenomenon since I drove my parents crazy. So everybody knows Jews complain more than other groups, certainly more than Christians. So that's a given. I even have a test. Get a Christian, get a Protestant, Catholic church, and a Jewish synagogue grouped together for lunch, an ecumenical lunch, and I arrange in advance to serve overripe cantaloupe. Which group will complain the most? Everyone knows the answer. The Jews will complain the most. Okay, so that's not a riddle. The riddle is why. And I have a fun theory, which I won't bother with, and I have a serious theory. And the serious theory is Jews look at suffering with the following statement: it stinks. And Christians look at suffering as being Christ-like. And that's the difference in views of suffering, which is fine. I love the fact that we don't agree on everything because we enrich each other. But I really do believe that the view of suffering is different. The word redemption, as was just used, that God will redeem this suffering, is not a concept I am theologically or emotionally comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. And isn't that precisely the point? Without the Messiah, you don't have a redemption arc. At least not yet in your story. So you're just, what do you do then? I mean, that is the point. Without the Messiah, you would struggle with this. I don't know how I would wrestle with this outside of my Christianity. I really don't. I just think that Dennis is 100% right. He's just like, look, this is a Christian view. When Jews think of suffering, they go, that stinks. When Christians think of suffering, they think of Jesus. Yeah. You might even say that that's true of every other person. Christians, when they think of suffering, they think of Jesus. anyone else, when they think of suffering, they just think of suffering. I think that's a profound observation. I don't know how universally true it is. I'm sure if you've got another idea, you can share that with us. But I just think that is exactly right. Jesus has some hard teachings with his disciples, with his followers, and it was particularly the one of eating my flesh and drinking my blood, right? The Eucharist, the communion. People are like, that's too far. And a lot of people walked away from him at that time. And he looks at his disciples and he's like, are you going to walk away from me also? And Peter says, where else would we go? Who else has the words of life? And I think of that when it comes to this question of suffering. Like legitimately, where else would I go? He's 100% right. And I think that and this comes back to the point that suffering is universal, but it's also completely unique. And here's what's crazy about the Christian view of suffering. When we think of Jesus, when the Christian faces suffering, we do think of Jesus. But I lost a friend of mine. It was a long time ago, but it was a group of our friends, and so we all went through the loss of our friend John. But I went through that loss very different than my other friends went through that loss. We all lost John, but we all lost him in our own way. And even though we're all friends and we all lost John, three of my friends, I think in particular, were there when he died, and I was not there. So my experience was very different from theirs. I was with his family when they got the news. So we all processed this loss in our own unique way, even though it was all of us going through, quote unquote, the same experience. And I thought about that when it comes to Jesus. Jesus is fully man, so he could suffer like we all suffer. But he's fully God, so he is infinite in his capacity for suffering. He could take on not just his own suffering, but the suffering of every person exactly the way that person suffers. So when the Christian says, like, God understands your pain, what we mean is when Jesus was dying on the cross, he knew what you were going through. He felt your actual pain, not pain like your pain. What was happening on the cross was that he was taking on the sin of the world. And maybe this is going too far, but I think that in that way, he knows exactly how you felt because he has the infinite capacity to take on that pain, that suffering, that sin, that our sin came with some consequences for the Messiah. And I wonder if Jesus is the only person who can look at you and say, I know exactly how you feel, because I felt that way when I was on the cross, or when I was in the garden, or as they were spitting at me and tearing out my beard and putting the crown of thorns on me, or tearing off the cloak. Like, I know exactly how you feel. He's the only person who can say that to you. That is not something to be dismissed, I think. So I think Dennis's point is very profound, and I think that I just don't know. Like, obviously, I come at this from a Christian worldview, and so that is my bias. But who else has the words of life? Like, what other option do we have? That's Jordan Peterson's question at the beginning of this. If not the Messiah, if not Christ, if not the infinite God who is also fully man, capable of taking on everyone's suffering. Suffering's universal, it's also unique, but God solved that problem on the cross. So he knows how we feel. I guess I wish I had more of an application point other than think about that. But maybe that's part of the transformation process.
May I just interject? I think that that's extremely profound and something that we ought to bear in mind symbolically. So I'll bracket the theological dimension to it. But if you think of the symbolism of the cross, then that is symbolism of the transformation of that which is unspeakably humiliating, being tied up naked, tortured to your death, the most appalling death imagined in the Roman Empire, as an image that is ultimately an image of redemptive. Yes. Yeah. Now, there is a very powerful set of images in the Hebrew tradition of separating yourself from evil, right? So one of them is here in the book of Exodus. You separate yourself from the oppressor. So you're not transforming the oppressor, you're not transforming the evil, you're separating yourself from it. So there's this very powerful Jewish or Hebrew narrative of separation
is that
from
to set
evil.
yourself apart?
Exactly, exactly. Now, to some extent, there's a counter-Christian imagery, which is not that of separation, but as it were of integration and transformation. Now, that seems to me a very intriguing opposition of, I'm just talking about symbolism here.
Oh, no. We're talking about much more than symbolism. Not of separation, but of integration. Okay. Oh, man. Of course, separating yourself from the evil, but not trying to ignore the pain that evil might bring. So we separate from evil. We want to live God-honoring lives, however you want to frame that. But we're not ignoring or discounting the trauma that might come from that evil. So that's what's integrated into our lives, rather than pretending like pain doesn't exist and allowing it, like I've said before, to cause more pain and sort of give birth to more bitterness. The cross allows us to integrate that pain, to see a purpose for that pain and that suffering, maybe. Is that what we're saying? That the cross, more than being a symbol, more than being an icon, is the collision of the greatest act of love and the greatest moment of pain. And it's hard to make a clear distinction from that, because do we then risk, if we can't integrate the pain of life, do we risk alienating ourselves from the love of God? I don't know where I'm going with this, guys. You're going to have to help me out here. This is, part of the magic of dialogue. I don't know that I believe that, but don't we see some of that bitterness? When we ignore our pain, it creates bitterness, and that bitterness, it's like the hard soil in the parable of the seed, the sower. That seed is not able to penetrate that hard soil. And so in a way, by sort of, ignoring that pain and not integrating it, we're also isolating ourselves from God's love, which is that's his redeeming force. Or maybe it's joy. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I think that's more than symbolism. I think that is, written into the fabric of reality there.
I was not brought up in the tradition you're describing. That was, for me, a one-sided, very lopsided view. And there's judgment. You take what happened to Sodom, or you take the prophets are outraged against evil. Or our Lord, the tomb of Lazarus, it says once he wept, and 3 times the Greek, he's furious. I don't recognize what you're saying. I was taught you should fight evil and overcome it.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, so they're touching on the point that it's like, no, we don't want to trivialize sort of like the evil in the world. And so Oz's point is that, God doesn't do that. God doesn't do that. He comes right into the problem. He comes into proximity of the problem. He gets his hands dirty. He touches earth. He gets down here where we're having the problem. And he does not give himself the cheat codes to life. When his friend Lazarus dies, he weeps. He goes through that process. He's furious about death. I mean, that's why he's here. He's going to conquer that, you know. So yes, I think they're doing a great job of reinforcing the point that Scripture is not trivializing evil in the world. There's judgment, and it's not trivializing the pain or the trauma that is brought in from that evil.
You were brought up more Jewish than most Jews.
No,
So this is, let me throw something out to the table, and I don't even know if I agree with this. It's just a notion. So first of all,
I actually just want to point out real quick that you notice how Jonathan Pageau has not talked for a while? He was the one that set this in motion with his statement of God is in the business of transforming evil into good, which got Denis on to push back. I mean, that was 5 minutes ago, and he's chilling. I don't know why. You know, I mean, it's probably wisdom. It's probably wisdom. You know, maybe he's like, what have I started? You know, I don't know. But that's that. Yeah, I think that's great. We'll get back. I think we end with Jonathan kind of reinforcing his point here in a second. But I just noticed that. Interesting. Jonathan's been silent.
We'll bookmark the overripe cantaloupe because I wouldn't stand for that. So that's proof of your argument here. Because I don't know what's wrong with you. Yeah, I mean, that kind of experiment is just unconscionable. So first, I want to just have that stated clearly. But so part of the Jews being the chosen people, part of that is to bring peace, right? That's part of being the chosen people. Is that right?
I think ultimately there's peace because people will come to God, and God wants us to be peaceful.
But part of being the chosen people is to negotiate that with people of other faiths, right?
Okay.
So maybe having a different orientation towards suffering is part of the role of being the chosen people, to keep calling attention when Christians are being, perhaps to a Jewish mindset, to accommodating
I like both approaches. I just wanted to illuminate that I didn't resonate to the original point of God turns everything into good. The evil remains evil. Our task is to conquer it, but you can't transform it. The tortured individual was tortured.
But okay. Does it stay evil if it has been transformed? You know, that's Denis's point. It's like, okay, we need to conquer evil. We can't transform it. I don't know. What do you think about that? I don't know that I agree that, like, I think that, again, that's the point, is that how that is the conquering of evil, is to not let the trauma of what has happened to you re-traumatize you throughout the rest of your life, but the ability to be free, truly free. I mean, we're talking about the Exodus here, right? We're talking about the Exodus. This is God's freeing of his people.
There's just a phrase here I just want to reread because I just find it so unbelievably beautiful. And that is, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I mean, the claim here that the cry of the human heart, that any suffering or sorrow is present to the creator of all things is perhaps it's absurd.
I mean, yeah, again, going back to even the point about the Messiah, like, God hears, he is there, he's not silent, he gets involved with human history. That's a beautiful thing, I think, that the Bible reveals to us about God. He hears the cry of his people, and he doesn't ignore them. He does have a solution. And it's not always easy for us. It's not always plain to us. But if we understand God as a father, then his sovereignty is not tortuous. Like we have to wait for him, and we have to wait for his justice. We have to wait sometimes for him to allow us to go through that process of healing. And I think it's important that God reveals himself as a father. He reveals himself to us as a father because he knows that process is not going to be easy for us.
Perhaps it's idiocy, but that's the claim here in this text right here.
Something at least in us responds to that. I mean, if we're suffering, and this bears on the other point about the redemption of suffering to some degree, I mean, you you do see people grow as a consequence of contact with adversarial circumstances and privation.
So that's post-traumatic growth. Again, Dan Allender's book, The Healing Path, goes into that a little bit more.
I know the moral issue you're dealing with here, because you don't want to justify evil by the good that it might be transformed into. That doesn't justify
that was the
evil.
point you asked me, or I don't know if you asked me, but you mentioned yesterday, well, you did. You said, do I resonate to the notion that Israel was built thanks to the Holocaust? That would be a good example of what you're talking about. And I said I was horrified by the notion.
Right.
Well, and is God, there's a whole other question here about God's sovereignty and God's sovereign plan. If God allows evil, is God culpable? I would say this: God does not cause the evil to happen, even though obviously if God is sovereign and in control and evil is happening, then God is allowing evil to happen. But to Jonathan Pageau's point, is he able to do that because he's also the one that's powerful enough to transform it into good? I mean, I think he could have started over with Adam and Eve. He could have wiped out human society there, and he would have been justified. But he doesn't. He covers their nakedness. He has a solution. Yeah, that's a hard one, but it's just hard. Yeah, ultimately, if we look, well, and I think that's where the sort of marriage of sovereignty and free will come in. I think that human free will exists within the sovereignty of God. They're not mutually exclusive, and so God is not guilty of sin because we're still sort of guilty. It's like sorry, but God is in the business of transforming that. So He is still holy and sovereign, even though we're sort of messing around with sin and causing evil and all that. So yeah, ultimately, I don't know. That's more of a philosophical solution to maybe what's more than a philosophical question.
Right, but you also agree that when people face adversarial circumstances, and even sometimes
totally. Well, adversarial is not the same as crucifixion or a gas chamber. There's a finality to that evil. You can't grow from dropping dead. You can grow if you continue to live.
There's a finality to the evil if biological death is death.
Okay.
There you go. And, oh man. Yeah, and again, what is the purpose of life? It's not like happiness in this material world. It's not our own comfort. And so there's a telos. There's that teleological question out there, the what happens after you die, that actually does help you. Now, is it just, hey, again, we're trivializing the pain and the suffering and the evil in the world if we just say God makes it all better in the end. We don't want to do that. And yet, knowing that God makes it better in the end at least gives us context. Okay, I know I said earlier that if I break my leg, knowing that it will be healed doesn't necessarily take away the pain. I will say this, though. Doesn't it give you some context, some hope that allows you to endure that pain? Biological death is not the end. I love dialogue. I love good dialogue, man. And this is good. There's something going on. There's something going on in the world that stuff like this is out on the internet.
Once we go to the hereafter, which I'm an adamant believer in, but we can't depend on that with regard to evil. I know that God will punish Hitler. It doesn't mean I don't fight Hitler here.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody suggest otherwise. At least when I was suggesting that God
I agree with you. But I'm only asking, if God does turn all evil into good, why fight evil?
Well, because of this fractal structure. Like, we are the sons of Adam, right? We are the mediators. We are the ones that God put as those responsible for creation. And so we have to We have to become the hands and the feet of God. We are the, right, or else how is it going to happen? And even in the story of Exodus, right, God doesn't just do it alone, right? God could have done anything. God could have just done it alone. He's like, no, I'm going to choose a man, and I'm going to work through him, and then not only him, but then I'm going to have Aaron, and then I'm going to have the Levites, and then I'm going to add this body so that all of this can happen through distribution. Yeah, this distribution of God's power into humanity. So
well, and there you go. We who follow God, we disciples of Jesus people, Christians, whatever, we're called to mimic God. We're called to be like him. We are called to be stewards of this earth. We are called to, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. We are to take the knowledge that God has revealed to us and live out this life according to that. Just as Jesus, obviously the name Christian means to be little Christ. I'm not claiming, some sort of divine divinity here, but to be like Christ in this world, to live like Christ. We take the Word of God and we incarnate it in some way. And so I think what Jonathan is saying here at the end is that ultimately that God's glory is revealed through an entire group of people that we would call the church, living out that mimicking of who God is in this world. That even in the midst of pain and suffering and evil, and you can think of the first century church doing this, that God is then glorified, the word of God is spread, and people are saved and they're healed, and that's it, right? That's the whole thing. Like, ultimately, we want salvation from sin. I mean, again, I hate to say it, but it's like, Francis of Assisi is claimed, was supposedly said, after getting an eye infection cauterized, basically a big hot, piece of metal being shoved into his eyeball. So, famously, supposedly said, when I became a Christian, I expected more pain than just having a hot needle shoved in my eye, And in first century church, it was often a very short process from baptism to the Colosseum, where they were being eaten by lions, and they knew it. They knew it, but something allowed them to face the Colosseum with hope, with the songs of worship on their mouths. And that's what we're talking about in this episode of this podcast. We're talking about the thing that allowed them to do that allowed them to go through suffering to the other end of suffering, which is joy and glory and healing. I truly believe that. Not selling snake oil here. Paul also said, if Christ is not raised, then we are above all else to be we're pitied or foolish. I forget exactly what it is. So yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder about that whole idea of the body being a representation of this, and if we as the church could in some way do a better job of reflecting his image and imitating him in this world, would the answer for human suffering be a little bit more obvious to those who are suffering and in need of a savior, in need of redemption? I mean, I wonder. That's where we're going to land the plane today. If you're here at the end, love you. Absolutely mean that. Thank you for going through this one with me, with us. Share this show with somebody who needs to hear it. That's all I would say. And I will catch you in the next one.